Episode 83. Turning wild game into food is a lot of work. 18th century hunting. Hello and welcome to the history of American food. This week I'll be looking at how hard it is to go from a hunted animal to a ready-to-eat meal. Just how much work is it to turn those critters into food? The thrill of the chase makes for the great stories, but turning that into dinner is a whole other giant pile of effort. But then there's the part where it also gets made into dinner 3 months from now, and that's where the real skill lies. I'll spend a little time looking at what animal critters were on the 18th century colonial dinner plate and how people felt about them. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that in 18th century terms, killing a wild animal for food has more in common with farming grain for food than we modern people realize. The harvest part is the one time where you're doing something everyone can see has a result. So of course that's what gets all the attention. Before and after that, it's a bunch of slow or repetitive stuff that gets made into movie montages or that fast forward bit in the videos on the socials. But it's also where all the real work and most of the skill lives. Before the Europeans arrived on the shores of the Americas, a sorting of the wild game animals had already started. Archaeology, brought to my attention by two great books of food essays, U.S. History in 15 Foods and The Larder, which focuses on the history of Southern food, points out that already agriculture, villages, towns, and cities had created areas where big game was scarce, and the small animals and birds were the prey of choice for the cooking pot. Geography and climate also contributed, but if you think about it, the agricultural habits of the locals along the East Coast, they had their fields that they defended from deer and forest bison and such. So as a result, it was turkeys, rabbits, squirrels, raccoons, possums, and other game birds, and the occasional porcupine and beaver that were to be found around villages. If one wanted deer, a hunt away from home usually had to be undertaken. So when the colonists arrived, there were deer areas, places where they were thick on the ground, as those places hadn't been cleared out in defense of crops. These, in fact, were the hunting grounds that we hear about as reasons for many a territory dispute. Which brings us to the thoughts that were going on in the heads of most of the 18th century Europeans figuring out how to make a home in what was to them the New World. Just about everyone coming from Europe knew that hunting larger game, deer or bear or boar, is what rich people did as a leisure activity. Or it might be what people working for rich people did as a living. Gamekeeper and forester were jobs, but the woodsman living in the forest cottage, going out and chopping wood and hunting wild game to keep his family, was mostly an old-fashioned fairy tale. By the 18th century, most of the people living in Europe lived on farms, sure within sight of the woods in most cases, but the dangerous or large wild animals of the forest that inhabit fairy tales and myths were just that, stories. As the continent and the islands of Britain had re-peopled after the 14th century, that most recent low point of population, what with war and plague and all, cities had been built and rebuilt, farms had been re-established, and the estates of the royal and the noble had been carved out. So for much of Europe, and frankly for most of the people in Europe, yes, there were wilds with wild animals. But the days of wolves snatching babies out of cradles, wild pigs rooting up the garden, beavers messing up the mill stream, deer eating up your herbs, and lions terrorizing the ladies at their washing, these were as much bedtime stories for the 18th century European as they are for the modern person. Maybe even more so, as we are dealing with the bother of garden-wrecking hogs and deer in ways they would not have. Yes, these wild animals existed in Europe, but only in royal preserves or off in the wilds of Scandinavia or Russia or in the lonely Scots Highlands. Not near farms and cities where people lived. You went on a hunting trip, and nobody but the very wealthy went on trips for leisure. People might go on voyages for business, war, or pilgrimages, and maybe travel for weddings and such. But they didn't just go on a trip for fun. For most people, meat was something you raised or purchased, or in the case of small game, rabbits and birds and such, you trapped. So upon coming to the New World with game to hunt, there was a bit of a shift in thinking. maybe the common man could simply hunt for his dinner and not raise the cattle. Could it be that easy in this rich land? It turns out, alas, not. The first problem was that if you just go out and shoot your daily deer or turkey or whatever, sooner than you'd think, you run out of turkey and deer. The men in 17th century Jamestown, though they had boggled at the great number of deer when they first arrived, soon enough found themselves eating their horses. And each village and later town, as they were established, had issued advisories, proclamations, and even laws instituting hunting seasons. But as we talked about before, these were not particularly enforced. And more to the point, even if European residents had followed the hunting seasons, the merchants back in Europe and their colony-side agents had incentivized the tribes living between the towns and the Appalachian Range to hunt the deer to near extinction. For Europe had gone mad for deer hides. I mean, they were already mad for European deer and reindeer hides of the far north. They are so much more supple than the cow hides coming out of the salt beef industry. But deer had become a bit thin on the ground in Europe, especially in the areas where people were. And in the places people weren't, getting around took a while. No roads and such. But in the New World, the introduction of firearms, horses, and liquor, along with iron pots and needles and mirrors and such, created incentives for the natives to hunt to provide hides and even meat to trade at rates that had never been seen before. The full madness is back in episode 69 on deer. Anyway, the relatively rapid de-deering and general removal of large game animals, including bear and forest bison from the more populated and well-established agricultural areas, continued the habit long established in both Europe and America, even before the Europeans showed up all smelly and loud in their boats. Which meant that by the 18th century, only the rich hunt, and it is a pursuit done for leisure, had largely started to return as a way of thinking. A large part of the 18th century population saw farming as the real work and hunting as a lazy man or a rich man's way to supply the table. And the myth persisted, even though people who were hunting knew very differently. Hunting to place food on the table is as much work, if not more work, than agriculture at times. It's just the work looks very different. It's also why most societies, if agriculture makes any sort of sense, will take it up and make some version of it at least part of their foodways. Now here in modern America, as a nation that has lots of guns, like more guns than have ever existed forever in the whole entire world before now, Americans now hunt for the pot much less than we ever have in the entire existence of the country, which seems very backwards and odd. In fact, even with so many millions of people taking up so much space, large game animals and tasty game birds are showing up and hanging out among us with impunity. Turkeys chasing students around Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Canada geese traipsing around any open green space they can find. At some level, as we curse the goose poop on our walk in the park, we know hunting for our food and processing it is an enormous amount of messy work, so we end up just dealing with the goose poop and getting his stat. But what does the 18th century arranging of wild game by the presence of agriculture mean in terms of who ate what when it came to game? Well, first of all, birds. If you've ever snuck up on a chicken or tried to catch a goose, you know they don't like it and will punish you by yelling very loud, or they'll get you with their hard bill on the end of that snaky neck. But for the 18th century people with an empty stomach and lots of practice, suddenly taking out those birds really isn't that hard. Birds were caught and killed and consumed by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, by the millions in the 18th century by rich and poor alike. And this is where the first sort of hidden work in hunting and animal harvest comes in. You have to know where the birds are and then go to the birds. There are migratory birds who are only in the neighborhood for part of the year, or, as in the case of the rotational passenger pigeons, only around for a while every few years. Then there are resident birds, those that live in particular sets of trees or an area of the forest or field or something. In all these cases, it was possible to shoot, which was less common at the start of the century, or net them. And in the case of birds that were poor flyers, like turkeys and passenger pigeons, just go and grab them, especially when they're sleeping. But regardless, you had to spend time wandering around, observing, returning to places, and basically knowing stuff. I mean, we know how to adjust the settings on our computers and bargain hunt in the grocery store. These 18th century people, while they might be confused by email, they would laugh at our ineptness in telling the difference between, say, a migratory bird, an owl, and a minnow. In general, birds are a nice kind of game as they are cooperatively tidy packages. Once killed, they are bled, and the digestive tract is often removed immediately, as that keeps it from bloating and exploding and fouling the meat. Though fairly often the cook was left with the job of cleaning out the crop, a storage pouch, the gizzard, the stomach, where grinding using swallowed rocks, since birds don't have teeth, so this is how they chew their food, and digestion, and then the intestines and the reproductive systems. From there, the birds would either be hung to tenderize the meat a bit before feather removal. All wild birds are notoriously lean, which is why fattened up geese and chickens and ducks and such for the holidays were such a big deal. And whether hung or readied for the stew pot immediately, they are usually scalded, that is, dipped in very hot water to loosen the feathers, and plucked. And before it's all done, the pin feathers, these little small pokey bits, also need to be singed off. As you might imagine, all of these steps are messy, especially those feathers that get around. Oh, and many of those feathers were trash, but a fair part of the chicken and duck and goose feathers were saved for numerous uses. The little down feathers, those were the super nice ones for really quality quilts and pillows. Medium feathers were good for stuffing less nice pillows, but were also used in the kitchen for brushes, oil, egg washes, colored solutions on pie crusts, sugar glazes, that sort of thing. And large feathers, goose tail feathers were the very best, were for writing. Part of the goose keeping industry included the periodic plucking of tail feathers out of live birds in the flock to sell as quills. I mean, they would grow more. Oh, and crow feathers or crow quills were used to make fine lines in illustrations. But the feather industry aside, the most important thing 18th century people knew was that all that processing took time, and for the most part, other than wandering around in the woods and capturing and killing the birds, the really messy and time-consuming work, that was done almost entirely by women. In camp, in the military, in cabins, in stately homes, the work of preparing birds to be meat was mostly women's work. When I talk about the changes in women's wardrobes and grooming in the 19th century, much of the fashion, especially in high society, was to be done up in ways that prove one could not possibly have been fussing with bird cleaning and trussing at any point that day or week. But cleaning duties aside, the sheer variety of bird flesh on the 18th century table would boggle the 21st century mind. Ducks were highly regarded since they are really the only truly fatty birds and part of why they float and are generally below par at flying. Watching all the different sea duckies getting their running start as they lift off from the surface of Puget Sound reminds one that flying is not what ducks do best. Because of the desire for fat on your eating ducks, summer and fall ducks are regarded as best, since that is when they have the most bugs and water weeds and whatnot to eat. It's also worth noting that duck was good enough that we retain duck on many modern menus, but the wide variety of ducks, things like teals, canvasbacks, mallards, and so on, have mostly disappeared. And the white domesticated or Pekin duck is mostly what's available. But the idea of duck as tasty lives on. But most of the other birds have fallen out of favor. There were songbirds of a startling variety baked in stews and pies and cooked in ragouts. Rotating through them seasonally as each showed up and made itself known was only sensible. Heron and cranes as larger birds were also regularly eaten, even if they were a bit stringy. The Christmas goose lives on mostly as an idea, and few of us now partake. In fact, many of those Canada geese that show up and eat the grass in our parks and leave behind the little goose bombs were a result of restocking efforts by American and Canadian game wardens when the earlier populations had been mostly wiped out. In the Depression, the governments were looking for ways to help out the rural householder who couldn't afford to buy much meat. In fact, other than large birds of prey that were just simply too hard to catch and frankly could really mess you up if you did, any bird was more or less considered potential dinner for anyone who could bring it down. In fact, the city pigeons we all live with now were also brought over by early colonists as a meat source. They would look at us as weirdos for letting them become a nuisance in the first place. They'd also laugh at the desire to eat some of these birds medium rare. I mean, that's how you get sick. Stew them up good. Wild birds are good food, but they're also a bit of a bother to catch, which is why raising the barnyard chickens and turkeys and ducks was so appealing. At least with them, you always knew, more or less, where they were. Let's look at some other critters. They too have the issue of the work that is the hunt. Weirdly, a little geometry comes into play here. Little critters have a high surface to mass ratio. In critter standards, that means there is quite a bit of pelt to deal with to get at the meat. Some pelts were valuable: rabbits, raccoons, and certain swamp rats like muskrats, nutria, beavers, and that furry weasel, mink. A New England species of mink will go extinct in the 19th century when they are hunted for their fur. Now, many of these animals were hunted for both their insides and their outsides, making the bother of skinning, rather than simply singeing the hair off, worth the trouble. But possums, especially, which have good fat and less valuable fur, were skinned less often. A wild-fed possum, much like a wild-fed raccoon, were generally considered tasty. The modern versions we see, that mostly eat garbage, also reportedly taste that way. While porcupines are edible and were eaten by Native Americans, it was the rare colonists that would have dared to take on that task. It might be worth it to just go after the supremely risky skunk instead. The squirrels and rats that were around were also eaten, but because of their woodland location and, let's be honest, their adorable furry tails, squirrels were seen as acceptable if somewhat unsatisfying. While rats, with their long association with filth, sewers, and bilges of ships and trash piles, along with that creepy naked tail, were seen as unacceptable food. That doesn't mean they weren't eaten, it just means they were probably called squirrel, if anyone asked. Like the birds, before you even got to the point of turning them into food, there was lots of work to be done in the finding and capturing and killing. Once again, the tracking and capturing and harvesting and bleeding, that was all done in the field. The skinning and cleaning, that was once again done by the cook. This division of labor, one dealing mostly with the live animal and the other entirely dealing with dead flesh, was made much of when considering the status of the cook in the cooking over open fire, no running water, no refrigeration days. Part of the lowly status of the cook came from the fact that they regularly dealt with dead flesh. As the chef starts to gain status in late 18th century Europe, the first sort of European celebrity chefs emerge. Part of the railing against bringing such persons into above-stairs society is the fact that they deal directly with the bodies of the dead that were used to make up the impressive spreads of the genteel and royal tables. This act of transforming these animals into meat was an absolutely essential part of the cooking process. But the more food a society was able to grow, rather than hunt, and the more layers a society had, the more the act of turning animals into food became a lowly and dirty job. Kitchens in large establishments, palaces, religious houses, and the like have always had stratification in kitchen duties. And this, of course, existed even in homes that were only able to afford a single servant or slave or take in a poor or orphan relative or two. In all of these places, there were people that mostly made food, and then there were people who cleaned up after the making of food, changed the fire, washed out the pots, removed the bones, cleaned off the platters, washed down the tables, and so on. But it was with this rise of the first celebrity chefs that there started to even be a grade of chef who only ever touched meat. The idea of dealing with the act of transforming the bodies of the dead into food was beneath them. So far, all I've talked about are the little animals. It is important to note that so far these were considered pretty egalitarian overall. They were eaten more or less by everyone, and would continue to be so eaten all the way through the 19th century. Mark Twain's list of foods he loved includes quite a bit of small game, and he was a well-off celebrity writer, though he also spent some time lamenting that such variety in victuals was already on the wane. It is important to note that there was a marked difference in people's attitudes about small game between the 17th and the 18th century. In the 17th century, there was an acknowledgement that anyone and everyone might be faced with an empty larder. Small game were an essential part of everyone's table. By the 18th century, when agriculture was much better established, small game was regarded as a supplement to agricultural endeavors. But no one should only be eating small game. There also started to be a class distinction in how one got their game. Hunting or foraging for small game as a living was seen with some suspicion. Farmers as landowners were the core of society. Someone who mainly ranged on wild lands was on the outside. In the colonies hosting larger populations of enslaved people, who were often charged not only with growing crops for others, often had to feed themselves through their own gardening, gathering, fishing, and hunting efforts. Along with the fact that local tribes hunted all their meat meant that foraging as the main way of gathering food started to seem suspect. And even though everyone seemed to enjoy a nice fat possum or rich duck stew, there did start to be a suspicion of hunting as a major food source. Which brings us to our last class of foods, the big game, the best regarded game, the game that will develop the first hunting culture in the colonies and then the states. The deer and the moose and the forest bison and the bears, and quite honestly the semi-feral pigs that were known to wander the woods. As the woods had been pressed back and some urban centers, almost all of which were around ports at this point, were formed. All the tasty large game had been pushed away from the people, which incidentally meant so had the large predators. The wild cats and wolves that had once prowled around the doors and harassed the goats of the 17th century colonists, they had moved back away from the edges of civilization with their dear prey. With only about 50 years with wolves close enough to snatch babies from most people's cradles, most American legends do not focus on this. Though the tall tales of people living on the frontier will talk of children snatched by the screaming painter, that is, the panther or wildcat of the Appalachians, along with some children raised with bears or at least taught to wrestle by them, and of course there are all those pet deer. The practice of hunting to hounds and deer chases will make their way over with other English fashions. Even today, there are still hunts across farmland after foxes in a few last places in the southern states. But hunting will become enough of a party for the large landowners that after the Civil War, there will be a whole industry created around the business of recreating an imagined version of such hunts. And the hunting dog, the first of which arrived at Jamestown, were an important item for anyone with a large landed estate as well as for many a smaller scale hunter. The hunting traditions of America will develop into something all their own, but their roots lie in the practices of European hunters. And because the deer and the pigs and the bison and the moose and the bears are all animals large enough to not get all eaten up in one sitting, the hard work of preserving these animals comes in. Most of the colonial hunters of the 18th century were coming from northern Europe. Just about the only way to preserve game in these largely cool and damp regions was salt and smoke. But the noticeably warmer weather and in places much drier climate of the Americas introduced more people to the idea of drying meat. While wind-dried salt cod was a known thing, and that was the exception, drying the meat of large game animals, this was a new idea that will eventually entirely change the way people traveling and fighting wars will be fed. The discovery of pemmican will absolutely turn the society of the original inhabitants of the Americas inside out to almost the same extent that commercial tea and opium poppy cultivation scrambled society in India and Central Asia. The end of the British colonies absolutely depended on the meat of hunted animals, large and small. But the colony's vision of itself as an agricultural engine first and a fat land for the well-off to enjoy second meant that hunting wild foods will become a fringe activity. What was once central to survival starts its journey to being looked down upon, unless it's done entirely for fun. Begins here in the 18th century. Now, it's normal enough now, as just about everyone needs some wild produce, even if just fish and birds to supplement their agricultural output. But the desire to eat only from domesticated civilized sources is laid out, and the wild needs to be pushed, and here's that important American idea again, it needs to be pushed away. So next time, yes, I do need to take another week off since I'm going on a big fat research trip in the Philadelphia area. It will be time to look at pemmican, its history, and how it is about to absolutely upend adventure and trade, as well as the setup for how it will change the life of the prairies forever. Thanks for listening. Any questions or quibbles will reach me by email at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter and Instagram at @THOAFood. Coming up are going to be a whole bunch of pictures of all the amazing food I get to eat in Philly. I mean, it's certainly an eating town. And speaking of questions, start gathering them up. The end of the season is getting here quickly. Like last time, there will be a show where I'll answer questions I didn't get to and the ones that you send me, along with maybe a few extra fun facts I've picked up along the way. A few words to review this podcast on your favorite podcast widget really do make a difference and help make me more visible to the food and history curious alike. And I enjoy finding them when I'm poking about in our fractured podcast world. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with promised pictures and links, I will eventually include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. And now, the bibliography is up if you're curious where I'm getting much of my information. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta and post.news bios at THOA Food and in the show description.